I'm Mona.
I'm Sophie Hannah.
And I'm Nushi Rose. Welcome to episode 61 of Ethnically Speaking, the show where we discuss everything affecting the UK's highly melanated communities, from pop culture to current affairs and everything in between. Now, we're back with a brand new lineup, but do not fear, Anissa will be dropping in from time to time and joining us for our conversations. And today's conversation is on the connections between geography and personality. So some of us, for example myself, wake up each morning and have our affirmations in our mirrors, telling ourselves what nice people we are. This is something I and many others believe, but the science says otherwise. For Londoners like myself, that meant we were much more likely to be very unconscientious and not as kind to others as people elsewhere in the country. For our friends in the north, for example, they were much more likely to be disorderly or even rebellious. But can we trust these findings? Do you guys think that you have a connection in your neighbourhoods to the people that live near you? Is there a similarity in your personalities and your types of views that you hold? Or is it complete hokum? And are these findings exaggerated? I want to know what you guys think.
Part of me feels that some of this is like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I know, I'll use my sister for example. Me and my sister grew up in different areas of London, and she is like a typical South girl. And I didn't really know much about South London because I'm not from South London. I wasn't born in South London. But she would always live up to this stereotype, and I say this very carefully, this stereotype of being like a very rude, in your face, aggressive type of South London girl. And she would just say to me, that is how South London girls are. Now, when you're young and you're not too aware of like stigma and stereotype and overgeneralization, you don't actually see the harm that does. We found the humor in it. But as we've gotten older and we have conversations with our friends, we've realized that overgeneralization can become a stigma. And that stigma is very detrimental. And it can also cause I think it can cause a negative impact for the people in that community, as well as limit them in other aspects in terms of like jobs, for example, because I know that when I filled out job applications, some of them have asked me for my address. I find that really baffling because if I'm a successful applicant, then I understand why you would need that information. But if I'm not successful and I'm just applying for a job, why is my address necessary? I would be inclined to believe that I would be given preferential treatment in comparison to someone else based on our geography if I lived on somewhere that was, I don't know, let's say a more desirable part of London, considered to what somebody else might class as a deprived area or the ghetto, or just something that has a negative stigma attached to it.
Do you know, I never even thought that that's the reason why they would want people's addresses. I literally thought, I don't know, they want to put it on file or whatever. But it's true, it is easy to make assumptions about people based on where they live. And I think where you live does have some sort of impact as to the person that you are. Like, as you were talking about your sister Mona, like the people you grow up with, the people you grow up around who live in the area are definitely going to have effects that you can't help but mimic. And yeah, mimic and be like what it is that you see and you interact with every day. But I would also say that I think that other things also have a big effect as well, like class, poverty. I think those things have a big effect because those things are also really linked to the areas where people live as well. So the people in Mayfair are going to be very different to the people in Manchester. And when we talked about the people in the north, or Nushi talked about people in the north being, much more rebellious, I think some of that has to do with the way that people are grown up. Like if you go far north, I'm not talking about Milton Keynes because that's what Londoners think. And when people live in the north, they get very upset about that. But like if you think about the Manchesters, the Newcastles, like people have been shafted by Southern England. Like there is a way that England has kind of monopolized money and opportunities, talents or whatever, and things are starting to change now, but they've grown up with a very big distrust and rebellious nature towards things that go on in the south, and they're much more willing to kind of protest in places like Manchester or things like that. So I think those things have kind of crafted the way people are, like the economics and the things that are going around, which also, have an effect on what people's characters or dispositions are like.
But what do you guys think about, so as part of this, another study that was done on the back of that one, there were other research that was done basically looking at people's attachment styles and their success in romantic relationships. Northwest London, obviously, not much hope for us here. However, but in America, they were looking at the different states and basically, the two, I guess, most damaging attachment styles you can have in a relationship is if you're anxious, like basically insanely clingy, or if you are preoccupied, if you're slightly detached and you can't really commit to a person. There's always like a level of intimacy that you won't be able to provide for your partner. And they found huge correlations, like in certain parts of the States, like the sort of Midwest, I think, was meant to be, you have more successful relationships there compared to other parts. And part of what they said was this was to do with, they believe, the landscape and just the geography of certain areas. In terms of mountains, for example, they said that if you're more introverted, you would go to like a mountainous landscape and things like this, and those things then replicated for romance as well.
I think that's a very interesting point, because when I was also reading up on that as well, I have heard a lot that the psychology of humans is influenced a lot by their environment. And I do believe that to a certain extent, because I do think that if you are blessed to be in a place that has more mountains and very like cinematic, and it could influence you in terms of how you navigate the world. I do agree. But again, to a certain extent, I think because everyone has individual characteristics, and regardless of where you are brought up, as much as you are a product of your environment, you are not 100% influenced by those factors. And I think that these types of studies that are projected, people can almost engulf it and take it as Bible and think, okay, I'm not going to date somebody from this state or this state or this state because we're not going to get along and their lifestyle is like this. Everyone's different. Some people might grow up in California, and because it seems so calm and easy breezy and the stereotype of everyone like surfing and having like a beach board, you might meet someone who has characteristics of, I don't know, New York. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think it's dependent on the individual. So I wouldn't necessarily say that I agree with that wholeheartedly.
But I guess this whole conversation is really like a nature versus nurture type thing, because that's where I really see it centering on, because as you guys are saying, there's certain things that you're born with and there's certain things that your environment influences you to have as well. And I think that's why. So let me give an example. So I was reading Afua Hirsch's book British a while ago, and she was talking about, she grew up in like Wimbledon, which is like a very middle class area, Wimbledon in London. And she was saying at her school, the conversation wasn't whether you were going to go to university. It was more so like which university, how good were your GCSEs grades going to be? And then she talked about her partner who grew up in inner city London in a poor area. He was of African descent, and like they had a lot of people staying in the house, like cousins and things like that. And she was saying even an idea that everyone in the class was going to go to university wasn't even a given, and how much harder he had to work to overcome what was really expected of people in that area. So I think there are always going to be people who go against the grain and do have the personality or the mental fortitude or the character fortitude to overcome their circumstances. But I think circumstances do weigh a lot, because if you're in a school environment where no one's expecting anything of you, then you really have to have something in the home upbringing that you have in order to kind of go against the grain. And I think that's what makes it so upsetting, is that if everyone was put in the same environment, a lot more people would be doing well and thriving and being successful. So yeah, I think it's nature versus nurture here that I think we're debating.
I'm so happy that you actually brought that point up, Sophie, because that was something I was going to go down as well. When it comes to schools, now correct me if I'm wrong, Michelle or Sophie, because when I was in London, I stayed there till I was about 13. And I only noticed when I came outside of London about catchment areas. So I don't really know if it's a thing in London, but where I'm from, if you live in a certain radius of a school, that's your quote unquote catchment area. Yeah. For you to come out of your catchment area, it's incredibly difficult. Now, my problem with that is we all know that there are certain communities that populate particular areas, right? And like I said, they might be stereotyped as the ghetto, deprived areas. not the best living conditions. If a mother wants to send her child to a school that is a little bit more affluent, has a bit more success stories and, better education, for her to send her child outside of her catchment area is incredibly hard, and they would use her geography against her. So I do think that having this geography and wondering if people are products of their environment, it does have sinister effects, because then it kind of goes into like social stratification. How can you kind of break out of that hierarchy if you're unable to access the same amount of opportunities that other people are who come from a quote unquote better area? It's not an equal playing field. So I completely agree with what you're saying, Sophie.
And I think it's just unfair that there's so many more hurdles to kind of be able to get the same sort of results. For a child to go to university in some areas, they have to literally defy all the odds, find that one teacher that's going to believe in them, like all these various things, where in other areas, it's just like not even the issue whatsoever.
I'd be interested to know how, when they make these studies, how they actually know, like how they define the different things. So is it self-defining? Is it me saying I'm more extroverted, I am more sociable, I'm more this? Or is it literally them looking at people's living conditions or, like their jobs or whatever, like really superficial things, to try and like understand it, extrapolate from those factors what the person represents and seeing them in that way? Because if that's the case, which it may be very well, like I completely agree with what you guys are saying, because I guess it's that thing where geography may be like the one thing that unites this group, but actually the reason that they may have like similar perspectives on life is actually because they've been socialized in a very specific way. And like that's one like unifying factor. It's not really, it's more to do with the social conditions and who they meet, the conversations they have, the opportunities that are available or not available to them, rather than something intrinsic to that specific place.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting, because even if we think about some of the protests that are going on in Northern Ireland, and people might say, oh, Northern Ireland, like they might be violent, but I'm just like, it's a very, if you look at the history of the country, like that kind of rebelliousness, that protest has been something that has been part of their society, part of the way that they've had to interact with the world because of very different circumstances. And I feel like if you put other people within that history for decades, then you might see the same sort of behavior. I don't think it's based on just the fact that, well, if you're born in Northern Ireland, chances are, like, I don't really believe that. But I think culture has a lot to do with it as well. So for myself, I grew up in London or the outskirts of London, and now I've moved to like the East Midlands. And I wouldn't say that I feel like I necessarily feel like I 100% fit in, but that's because I'm now living around people who don't share the same culture or racial background. And it's not even that I had that growing up, to be honest, because we were like the only black family on our street for like the longest time until I was late teens. So it's not even that, but there is a sort of sense in terms of being similar to other people. There's also that racial aspect that I know that I have a feeling of feeling similar to people who share the same race as me. Like there's certain things you don't have to explain, and there's a sort of understanding about certain things that makes me feel very similar or to those people that I wouldn't feel so much where I live now in the East Midlands. So I think it really depends. There's so many different aspects where I think that I can kind of belong and not belong, because sometimes when I hear about inner city London experiences and people talk about like the poverty and like how rough it is, that wasn't my experience growing up. That wasn't the experience that I had. So even on that basis, like I don't resonate with that when I necessarily see it, because I'm like, well, my experience was different growing up. If people think, oh, that's how black people in London are, I'm like, well, not all of them are, some aren't. So I think there's various different factors that can feed into what people are like, and then when you add in like gender, race, class, yeah, it's a big melting pot.
And I think just throwing that statement out there anyway, like are people products of their environment or due to their geography, is their personality like this or like that? That's actually quite subjective, because if you look at London now, there's a lot of areas where gentrification is happening. So the London that we knew in terms of how Brixton was before compared to how Brixton is now, it's not the same at all. Like I most of my life was born and bred in Notting Hill. And I know now, like when I say to people, oh yeah, like I'm from West, I'm from Notting Hill, they're like, damn, you got money, honey. I'm like, the Notting Hill that I knew back then, like I've said, my mum's from a Middle Eastern background. There was a very, very multicultural, there's some parts of Portobello you'd go down and you'd only hear Arabic. You'd be thinking, I'm in the Middle East. That was where my mum's community was. When you think of Notting Hill now, due to people like Made in Chelsea, you think you're going to bump into Mark Francis. The Notting Hill that people have in their mind now is completely different to what it was then. And I almost have a problem with that, because depending on the cutoff period, as to, let's say somebody was to say right now, job application, like I made the example the last time, filling out a job application and someone to say they're from Brixton, that might not limit somebody today, which is amazing. But go back a couple of years ago, somebody might have had to lie, or somebody might feel ashamed of where they come from because of the stigma associated with that area. So what makes it okay for one and not okay for the other, which is why I don't think that this claim I don't think it can be oversimplified. I think, like I said the last time, it does have quite sinister claims and people need to be careful with it.
I think, Mona, I so agree. And I also think it's that thing where I feel a lot of people will just use the fact that somebody comes from a certain place as justification to have a really negative view.
Yes.
And if we kind of accept like these kind of things, like there's this guy, like not to get like super academic, but there was this guy I used to be super obsessed with, this man called Jeffrey Sachs, who used to be the head of the World Bank. And he had this whole theory which basically dominated loads of the ways that we understood culture, poverty, developing countries, all these different things for decades. And his whole point was basically that the geography of any country is the reason that it's poor. And so he'd use factors like how landlocked something is. If a country is hotter, then it's more prone to disease, for example, and tons of different things like this. But people never really questioned it until about 15, actually less than that, until about 8 years ago, when they started coming up with obviously new theories that showed that there was no way in hell like this was the only way to understand why poverty exists. But if you justify it in that way, then obviously like it shores up everything the World Bank does, aka like dominate, from my perspective, dominate and control other nations from the West. And so, you know, like literally, even now, I mean, he was president of the World Bank, like this guy and his theories dominated everything. And it's only now, the fact that we're only questioning it now is worrying, but it shows that people did use it to excuse lots of really serious problems and issues that affected huge swathes of the world and their quality of life for a long time.
I think that's a really interesting point that you're making, Nushi, because I think it boils down to you have to question whenever anyone tries to put you in a box because of where you live or your geography or even the assumptions that we have about places. Because I was reading, I think in a Bustle article, Bustle magazine, and they were saying how London is seen that the people who live in London are more creative. And in my head, I'm just like, well, if you're talking about the UK, chances are it's probably the creative capital of the country. Like the most museums and culture and art galleries and all these various things are in London based. Or if you're talking about some of the biggest companies, probably the most opportunities and jobs and in terms of wages. So it's going to draw people from all over the country who are creative in order to be able to kind of explore their gifts and their talents. And then to say that London's the most creative, I'm like, well, if you take out all those cultural things and all those artistic places and creative spaces and you took them out of London, would that still be the case? So yeah, we really have to break down when people want to make like these sweeping statements about places. But I would say that people in London are probably a little bit more unfriendly than other people in the United Kingdom. That one, I have to say, I think it is true.
I have to agree. I have to agree with you on that. Sophie. I do think they can be very unfriendly. I actually find that very baffling because I think that coming from such a cosmopolitan city and things like the tube, for example, you get so many people from different walks of life on the tube. Why are you all so stank-faced? What's wrong with you? I get that it's early morning, but people are so like segregated and partitioned in their own ways. They have their headphones in. They don't really want to make eye contact. And God forbid if you do make eye contact with someone and you smile, it's like, what? Why are you so rude? I don't understand. But then again, I have gone to other countries where I feel like in the city, it is the same type of thing. Like when I was in Paris, I found people in Paris when I was on their underground, which is amazing. It's actually quite similar to London. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. They were similar. They were a little bit rude. So it might not be necessarily Londoners. It might be like rural areas versus suburban areas. I'm not too sure. But going off what you said something about that sweeping statement, I completely agree. It's so dangerous because I know one of my friends said to me that Birmingham, people from Birmingham are untrustworthy. And I said, you've never lived in Birmingham a day in your life. Why do you think that? Him, I just heard it in a questionnaire. And I said, and now you are now taking that statement, projecting it onto other people. Imagine if you passed that off as, people would believe it because you said it with such conviction in your chest. You can't say things like that.
Do you know what? That's so funny, but it's so true. Like we do have these generalizations. Like when I moved from London, to be honest, I have to look back with a bit of shame now, because I moved to the East Midlands when I got married, and when I was hanging around with people that my husband knew, I'd be like, "Oh, I miss London." They're like, "Do you miss London?" I was like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Everyone wants to be there," and they're like, "Nobody wants to be there." I was just like, "What?" I was like, "Everyone wants to live in the city." They were like, "No." They're like, "It smells and it's congested. There's no living space." And I was offended. I'm like, "What?" But after I lived where I lived for a couple of months and I went to visit a family in London, I'm like, it does kind of
changes.
I'm telling you, perspective change. I was just like, actually, you have to, and that's the good thing about traveling. Like it allows you to break down those misconceptions that you have about various places. And you'll find that most people who live in London will have traveled internationally, but have never gone 4 hours up north. So it's really important, especially in the United Kingdom, because parts of the United Kingdom are like different places. Like people who are like Northerners or from Manchester or from Liverpool, like some people in Liverpool will say they're not even British. They're like, we're not British. And Northerners won't call themselves English. They're like, I'm a Northerner. Yeah, so it's really weird. Like it gets different the further up you go, and you find really it's only people maybe in London who will say that, you know, yeah, I'm in England or I'm British. Whereas further up, they don't say that. They'll be like, I'm Liverpudlian.
That's true. Yes, that's true. That is true.
Yeah. I have to say though, guys, like I used to live in a colonial reenactment town. And so everybody...
I'm sorry, Nushi. A what? A what?
Like
what is that?
It's like a living museum.
A live-in museum.
A living museum. So rather than you going to the museum and like you see inside a case, it's alive around you. And so there's no electricity.
Where's this? Where's that?
In Virginia. There's no electricity. You have to wear colonial garments. And obviously, it's very old school, you know. There aren't kind of modern shops that, for example, I see in London today. But I would say that there were definitely characteristics that many of the people who chose to live that way had. But maybe that wasn't the geography. Maybe that was the style of life.
Do you know what? But it makes me think of something that I saw, because it was saying that birds of a feather flock together. So it was saying if you're someone who wants to have like a busy city life and travel around and go from here to there, they were like, you're going to be more drawn to the city. If you're someone who wants a quieter life, you're going to move to an area that is probably a bit more low key and quiet. And then you do these surveys to say, oh, all the people in Cornwall are just really calm. And it's like, well, people move there because they want a calm lifestyle. Yeah. So it's going to draw people who are attracted to certain types of living conditions.
Yeah, exactly. That's so true. Yeah, I guess you're also like the point you're making is also about this social influence, right? Which is if you hear an area is a certain way, obviously you're going to move there if you're unhappy where you're living. And yeah, that's also I guess that's also the other thing that all these like studies forget to mention. It's like you're not trapped in a place your entire life. Like you're not like, you know what I mean? It's not like this cage that we all have and we're all the same and like live together in a certain way. So yeah, I agree with that. Definitely.
So why did you end up living in the colonial town? How? I'm sorry, I can't get over that.
Neither can I.
How? Was there like an application process? Did you have like a video interview? Oh, they definitely don't have video interviews.
No video interview.
But like, how? Exactly. Were you part of someone's harem? Like, what happened?
It was because of my famous apple butter. No, I'm kidding.
Oh my days.
Oh no, I was only there for a year.
Okay. Did you enjoy it?
I'm glad I did it. And I mean it's a different way of life, you know. But I mean, I had electricity while I lived there. I wasn't one of the reenactor people, but I just lived in the centre of the village. And it was, it's amazing because you're exposed to such a different way of life. And because I lived in a sorority house in the centre of the Colonial reenactment town. And so my lifestyle was slightly different to the people around me, but obviously you're still participating in certain activities with the actors. So for example, you'll attend the rallies, or you'll go help in the apothecary if they need potions to be brewed or whatever it might be.
Okay.
Yeah.
A question
like
actually I do
10
have.
lives. I feel like you've lived like 10 different lives, honestly.
Sorry. A question I wanted to ask really quickly. Do you feel that geography impacts where you would like to potentially resettle, raise your children, etc.?
Good question, 100%. Where I'm living now, like I would definitely raise children here, but I'm concerned that there isn't, at the schools that I would look at, catchment areas, as you were talking about earlier, like how many children would there be from various different backgrounds? Because that is very important to me. I want them to be able to see other people like them and not to feel like outsiders, because I've seen how that's affected my nieces when they were growing up in a school that was predominantly white and Asian. And now that they've gone to a secondary school that has more black, it's kind of like, oh, okay, they can feel like they can fit in just that little bit more. So that is what I'd be concerned about. And in terms of geography, I said I would never move to America, ever. Because the whole guns, being black, if I had a son, not interested in it. So for me, geography would help me to make some very, very big life decisions about where I decide to reside.
I agree. What about you, Nishi?
I feel like very attached to Northwest London. Like I feel emotionally attached. I've always lived here. It's like even though I rent an Angel, I find myself in Wilston all the time. So in my mind, like I would love to live somewhere else at some point in my life for a bit, but I know if I ever find the one and have children, I would definitely want to be in Northwest London, just because I know it. The schools are also good here. And there's lots of green spaces, Hampstead Heath, and it's really easy to get around. But that would be why. It's not because I feel a really strong connection to all the people in NW10. What about you?
Same as what Sophie said. America. My dad is actually African American, and how he did it, I don't know. But I wouldn't raise any children in America. I think I would love to travel, but I think when you are a brown person, you have to be careful of the places that it's not that it's necessary that you can and can't go, but where you feel comfortable, and safety is something you have to think about. So 100% geography does play an impact, but I'm not having no babies yet, so I don't have to think about that right now.
All right, guys. Well, thank you for watching Ethnically Speaking. But let's not end the conversation there. What do you think? Do birds of a feather flock together? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're watching on YouTube, please do not forget to like, subscribe, and most importantly, hit that notification bell so that you never miss an episode. If you want a recap of everything we've discussed today, please head on over to unitedmelaningroup.com/ES061, and there's a full summary of everything there. But until then, we'll be back on Monday speaking about stealth wealth, aka should you hide your earnings from your friends and family, or should you be more open about how much money you're making? Before then, please wash your hands, wear your mask, keep your distance, and stay safe.